Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we descend deeper into the shadows with 8 new, disturbing true horror stories that have emerged from the scorching desert and forgotten corners of Arizona. These are not mere tales of urban legend or campfire stories passed down through generations. Instead, we bring you first-hand accounts of terror that have been meticulously documented and cross-referenced with local authorities, hospital records, and witness testimonies from across the Grand Canyon state. Each narrative comes directly from those who experienced the unthinkable in the most unexpected places. From the neon-lit checkout lanes of midnight grocery stores to the cursed ruins of Two Guns ghost town, and from the historic hotels of Prescott to the abandoned mining camps near Bisbee. The accounts you will hear tonight have been gathered through years of investigation, interviewing survivors, and piecing together fragments of experiences that most would prefer to forget. To ensure the safety of those brave enough to share their stories, certain identifying details have been carefully altered while preserving the terrifying truth of what happened. If you are new to our collection of forgotten horrors, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for daily, authentic horror content that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the darkness that lurks in our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth another buried file from the shadows of reality. My name is Marcus, and I have been a professional photographer for over 15 years. Specializing in abandoned places and forgotten corners of America. I have explored countless ghost towns, derelict buildings, and historical ruins across the Southwest, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered at Two Guns, Arizona, in March of last year. Some places carry more than just history. Some places carry the weight of unfinished business. Two Guns sits like a wound in the desert, approximately 30 miles east of Flagstaff along Interstate 40. Most travelers see only the graffiti-covered remains of an old gas station from the highway. But the real ghost town spreads across both sides of Canyon Diablo, connected by a crumbling concrete bridge from 1915. I had researched the location extensively before my visit, drawn by its reputation as one of the most cursed sites along the old Route 66. The history of Two Guns reads like a catalog of violence and tragedy. In 1878, 42 Apache warriors were murdered in what became known as the Apache Death Cave, suffocated by smoke when their Navajo enemies lit sagebrush fires at the cave entrance. In 1926, the eccentric Harry Miller shot and killed landowner Earl Cundiff in a dispute over a land lease, then was later mauled by his own captive mountain lions. Multiple businesses built on the site failed mysteriously, culminating in a devastating fire in 1971 that destroyed the final attempt to revive the town. Local Navajo and Hopi people avoid the area entirely, claiming the land itself is poisoned by the violence that occurred there. They speak of restless spirits and a darkness that seeps up from the earth like groundwater. I had dismissed these warnings as folklore until I experienced the truth firsthand. I arrived at Two Guns on a cloudy March afternoon, the kind of gray day that makes the desert look especially desolate. The wind carried a constant low moan as it moved through the ruins, creating an unsettling soundtrack for my exploration. I parked near the abandoned gas station and began photographing the obvious landmarks, working my way methodically through the scattered remains of buildings and foundations. The atmosphere felt heavy from the moment I stepped out of my vehicle. Desert locations usually have a dry, clean quality to the air, but Two Guns felt different. There was a thickness to the environment, as if the very molecules were saturated with something unpleasant. I attributed this to my knowledge of the site's violent history and continued with my work. My camera equipment consisted of a professional digital SLR, several lenses, and a sturdy tripod. I also carried backup batteries, memory cards, and a portable lighting setup for interior shots. The technical aspects of photography usually keep me grounded and focused, providing a buffer against the emotional impact of the places I document. but at 2 guns my equipment seemed to malfunction with unusual frequency. The first anomaly occurred while photographing the ruins of Harry Miller's zoo. The stone enclosures that once held mountain lions and other desert animals were still partially intact, though overgrown with desert vegetation and filled with decades of wind-blown debris. As I framed a shot of the largest enclosure, my camera's autofocus began hunting erratically, unable to lock onto any subject despite perfect lighting conditions. The LCD display flickered intermittently, showing brief flashes of what appeared to be movement inside the empty cage. I assumed the electronics were being affected by electromagnetic interference or desert dust and switched to manual focus. But when I reviewed the images later, several shots contained shadows that had not been visible to my naked eye during the shoot. Dark shapes that seemed to move between frames, always at the periphery of the composition. Never quite in focus, but unmistakably present. The temperature began dropping as afternoon faded toward evening, which was normal for high desert locations in March. What was not normal was the way the cold seemed to concentrate in specific spots throughout the ruins. I would be walking through an area of comfortable ambient temperature and suddenly step into pockets of frigid air that felt like walking into a freezer. These cold spots had no apparent source and did not correspond to shade patterns or wind direction. Near the old Route 66 bridge, I discovered the entrance to the Apache Death Cave. The opening was larger than I had expected, perhaps 8 feet wide and tall enough for a person to enter without ducking. Local authorities had installed metal barriers years ago to prevent access, but time and vandalism had created gaps large enough to slip through. Despite my professional interest in documenting the site, something about the cave mouth made me deeply uncomfortable. The darkness inside seemed to have weight and texture, as if it were a living substance rather than merely the absence of light. I set up my tripod outside the entrance and used my longest telephoto lens to photograph the interior from a safe distance. The images revealed stone walls carved with what appeared to be symbols or pictographs, though I could not determine their origin or meaning from the photographs. As I worked, I became aware of sounds emerging from the cave. At first, I thought it was simply wind moving through the underground passages, creating the acoustic effects common in cave systems. But gradually, the sounds began to resolve into something more disturbing. I could hear what sounded like voices speaking in a language I did not recognize, rising and falling in what might have been conversation or argument. The voices were accompanied by other sounds that defied easy explanation. Scraping noises like fingernails against stone, rhythmic tapping that reminded me of Morse code. And underneath it all, a sound like breathing, slow and labored, as if something large was sleeping fitfully in the depths of the cave. My rational mind insisted that these were acoustic illusions created by wind patterns and the cave's natural acoustics, but my body was responding to the sounds as if they represented genuine threats. My heart rate increased, my breathing became shallow. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to leave the area immediately. I forced myself to continue working, determined to document whatever was causing these phenomena. I switched to video mode and began recording the cave entrance while monitoring the audio feed through my camera's headphones. What I heard through the electronic equipment was far worse than what I had perceived with my naked ears. The voices were clearer through the headphones, speaking in urgent, overlapping whispers. I could not understand the words, but the emotional content was unmistakable. Fear, anger, and desperate pleading filled the audio track. Beneath the human voices, I could hear sounds that were decidedly non-human. Growling, hissing, and wet, tearing noises that made my stomach clench with revulsion. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ruins, the activity from the cave intensified. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in the span of minutes. The whispers became more agitated, occasionally rising to what sounded like screams before dropping back to urgent murmuring. My camera's battery indicator, which had shown 70% charge moments before, suddenly dropped to critical levels. I decided to retreat to my vehicle and review the footage I had captured. But as I began packing my equipment, I realized I was no longer alone at the site. Figures were moving among the ruins, silhouettes that seemed to absorb light rather than cast shadows. They moved with purpose, but not with the gait of living humans. Their movements were too smooth, too fluid, like smoke given form. The figures appeared to be converging on my location from multiple directions. I could not determine their number because they seemed to flow and merge together, separating and reforming in patterns that hurt to watch directly. When I tried to focus on any individual figure, it would become translucent and slip away from my perception, only to reappear in my peripheral vision. My hands shook as I finished packing my gear and retreated toward the parking area. The figures followed, maintaining a constant distance but never approaching close enough for me to get a clear look at them. Through my camera's viewfinder, they appeared more solid, revealing details that my naked eyes could not process. Faces that flickered between human and something else. Clothing that shifted between different time periods and styles. Eyes that reflected light like an animal's, even in the growing darkness. As I reached my vehicle, the voices from the cave rose to a crescendo that seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. The figures stopped their pursuit and turned toward the cave entrance, as if responding to some unheard summons. One by one, they flowed back into the darkness of the Apache Death Cave, moving with the inevitability of water following gravity. I drove away from Two Guns as fast as the desert roads would allow, not stopping until I reached Flagstaff. In the safety of my hotel room, I reviewed the photographs and video footage I had captured. The images told a story that my conscious mind struggled to accept, but that some deeper part of me recognized as truth. The cave photographs showed not just the pictographs I had noticed during shooting, but also faces pressed against the stone walls from the inside, as if people were trapped within the rock itself. The video footage captured movements and shapes that had been invisible to me during recording, a shadow theater of figures acting out scenes of violence and desperation. Most disturbing of all were the audio recordings. When I ran the cave sounds through professional audio analysis software, I could isolate individual voices speaking in what sounded like multiple Native American languages, as well as English phrases from different historical periods. The voices told fragments of stories about betrayal, murder, and endless imprisonment in darkness. Research into the specific history of the Apache Death Cave revealed details that had not appeared in my preliminary study of the site. The 42 Apache warriors who died there were not random victims of tribal warfare, but specific individuals who had been betrayed by someone they trusted. They had been led into the cave by a supposed ally who then delivered them to their Navajo enemies. Their deaths were not just murders, but betrayals that violated sacred bonds of trust and hospitality. According to tribal traditions that are rarely shared with outsiders, such betrayals create spiritual wounds that cannot heal through natural processes. The victims become anchored to the site of their deaths, unable to move on to whatever exists beyond this world. They remain trapped, reliving their final moments and drawing other violent deaths to the same location, creating an ever-growing community of the spiritually imprisoned. I have not returned to Two Guns, nor do I intend to. The photographs I captured there have been exhibited in galleries across the Southwest, but I never display the most disturbing images. Some things are not meant to be shared with the general public. Some darkness should remain buried in the desert where it belongs. But sometimes, late at night in my dark room, I hear whispers that remind me of the voices from the Apache Death Cave. And sometimes, when I develop photographs taken at other locations, I find shadows that do not belong to the subjects I was photographing. The darkness of Two Guns, it seems, followed me home, and I fear it will never completely leave me alone. The Apache were right about some places being poisoned by violence. Two Guns is not just a ghost town. It is a wound in the world that refuses to heal, and some wounds are better left undisturbed. My name is Trevor, and until last June I was part of a 4-person urban exploration team that specialized in documenting abandoned mining sites across the Southwest. We called ourselves the Desert Ruins Collective, and over 5 years we had explored dozens of forgotten mining camps, ghost towns, and industrial sites throughout Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. Our work combined photography, historical research, and video documentation to preserve the stories of places that were slowly being reclaimed by the desert. We thought we understood the risks involved in exploring these dangerous locations. The abandoned copper mine near Bisbee taught us that some places are abandoned for reasons that have nothing to do with economics or safety regulations. The Lavender Pit mine, operated by Phelps Dodge Corporation, was one of the largest open-pit copper mines in Arizona during its active years from 1950 to 1974. Located just outside Bisbee in the Mule Mountains, the mine produced millions of pounds of copper before being shut down due to declining ore grades and increasing environmental concerns. The massive excavation left behind a pit that measured over a mile long and 900 feet deep, along with numerous support buildings, processing facilities, and worker housing that were abandoned when operations ceased. Our team consisted of myself as the primary photographer, Lisa, who handled video documentation, Marcus, who specialized in historical research and mapping, and Jessica, who was our safety coordinator and climbing equipment specialist. We had been planning the Bisbee expedition for months, studying historical records, satellite imagery, and consulting with local historians to understand the layout and potential hazards of the site. The area around Bisbee has a complex mining history that spans over a century, with multiple companies operating different claims and extraction methods. The Lavender Pit was only the most recent and visible mining operation, but the mountains around Bisbee are honeycombed with older underground tunnels, shafts, and processing sites that date back to the late 1800s. Many of these earlier operations were smaller scale and less well documented, leaving behind a maze of forgotten excavations and abandoned equipment. We arrived in Bisbee on a Friday afternoon in early June, planning to spend the weekend exploring both the main Lavender Pit area and some of the older mining sites that were scattered throughout the surrounding mountains. The weather was typical for summer in southeastern Arizona, with daytime temperatures reaching the low hundreds and nighttime lows dropping into the 70s. The first day of exploration went according to plan. We documented the massive open pit, the abandoned processing equipment, and several of the larger support buildings. The scale of the operation was impressive even in its abandoned state, and we captured hundreds of photographs and hours of video footage. The industrial archaeology was fascinating, with layers of mining history visible in the different types of equipment and construction techniques used during various periods of operation. That evening, while reviewing our footage and planning the next day's activities, Marcus discovered references to a smaller mining camp located higher in the mountains above the Lavender Pit. According to his research, this camp had been operated by a different company in the 1920s and had been abandoned much earlier than the larger operation. The camp included several buildings, mine shafts, and what appeared to be a small smelting operation that had been built to process high-grade ore from underground workings. The appeal of exploring this lesser-known site was irresistible. These smaller operations often preserved details of mining life that were lost in larger industrial sites, and the camp appeared to be largely intact based on aerial photographs from the 1960s. We decided to hike up to the camp on Saturday morning, planning to spend the day documenting whatever remained of the buildings and equipment. The hike to the camp took approximately 2 hours. following what appeared to be an old access road that had been cut into the mountainside to transport equipment and supplies to the mining operation. The road was in poor condition after decades of abandonment, with sections washed out by flash floods and others blocked by rock slides. We had to navigate carefully around these obstacles while carrying our photography and safety equipment. The mining camp itself was more extensive than we had expected from Marcus's research. A cluster of wooden buildings hugged a natural shelf in the mountainside, connected by boardwalks and stairs that had been built to navigate the steep terrain. Most of the structures were in various stages of collapse, with roofs caved in and walls leaning at dangerous angles. But several buildings remained sufficiently intact to explore safely. The largest building appeared to have been the main processing facility, housing machinery for crushing and sorting ore before it was transported to the smelter. The equipment was still in place, though heavily rusted and partially buried under debris that had fallen from the deteriorating roof. We spent several hours documenting these machines, which represented mining technology from the early 20th century that was rarely preserved in such complete condition. Behind the processing building, we discovered the entrance to the main mine shaft. The opening was approximately 8 feet square and descended at a steep angle into the mountain. A wooden head-frame structure still stood above the entrance, though the cables and pulleys that would have been used to transport miners and ore cars had long since been removed. Warning signs posted by the Forest Service advised against entering the mine due to unstable conditions and the presence of toxic gases. Despite the warnings, the mine entrance was compelling from a documentary perspective. This was where dozens of miners had worked daily during the camp's operational period, extracting copper ore under dangerous conditions for minimal pay. Their stories were an important part of Arizona mining history, and the shaft represented a direct connection to their experiences. Jessica insisted that we maintain safe distances from the mine entrance and test the air quality before approaching too closely. She carried portable gas detection equipment that could identify carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, and other dangerous gases that sometimes accumulated in abandoned mines. The readings near the entrance showed acceptable levels of these gases, though she recommended that we avoid spending extended time in the area. As we set up our equipment to photograph the mine entrance and headframe, Marcus noticed something unusual about the shaft opening. Despite the bright afternoon sunlight, our powerful flashlights could not penetrate very far into the darkness of the tunnel. The light seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected, creating an effect similar to looking into a deep well at night. More disturbing was the sound that emerged from the mine. At first, we thought it was simply air movement through the underground passages, creating the acoustic effects common in cave systems. But as we listened more carefully, the sounds began to resolve into something that resembled human voices calling from deep within the mountain. The voices were indistinct but clearly present, rising and falling in patterns that suggested conversation or argument. Occasionally, we could hear what sounded like metal striking stone, as if someone were working with mining tools in the depths of the shaft. These sounds came in regular intervals, like the rhythm of pick and shovel work that would have been common during the camp's active period. Lisa began recording audio of the sounds while I documented the mine entrance with long exposure photography. The combination of the mysterious voices and the light-absorbing darkness of the shaft created an atmosphere that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. We all felt the pull of professional curiosity about what might be causing these phenomena. Marcus suggested that the sounds could be explained by air currents moving through the complex tunnel system, creating acoustic effects that mimicked human voices and tool use. This was a rational explanation that we all wanted to accept, but the regularity and clarity of the sounds made such natural explanations seem inadequate. As afternoon faded toward evening, the sounds from the mine began to change in character and intensity. The voices became more agitated, occasionally rising to what sounded like shouts or screams. The metallic striking sounds increased in frequency and volume, creating a cacophony that echoed from the depths of the mountain. Jessica was the first to suggest that we should leave the area. As our safety coordinator, she was responsible for recognizing when exploration conditions became dangerous and the increasing activity from the mine was making her nervous. The sounds were loud enough to mask other potential hazards, and the psychological stress of listening to what sounded like human distress was affecting the entire team. But as we began packing our equipment, the sounds from the mine suddenly stopped. The silence was complete and immediate, as if someone had thrown a switch that cut off all activity in the underground workings. The contrast was so stark that it was almost more unsettling than the previous noise. Then we heard footsteps. Heavy boots were walking up the mine shaft toward the entrance, accompanied by the sound of metal tools dragging against stone. The footsteps were regular and deliberate, like someone climbing a steep incline while carrying heavy equipment. Based on the acoustic properties of the sound, whoever was walking was still deep in the mine, but approaching the surface steadily. None of us spoke as we listened to the approaching footsteps. According to our research and the Forest Service warnings, the mine had been abandoned for over 80 years. No current mining operations existed in the area, and the shaft was considered too dangerous for recreational exploration. Yet someone was clearly walking up from the depths of the mine, moving toward where we stood at the entrance. The footsteps grew louder and more distinct as they approached. We could hear the scrape of boots on stone, the clink of metal tools, and what sounded like labored breathing echoing up from the darkness. The person climbing toward us seemed to be carrying a significant load and struggling with the steep grade of the tunnel. Lisa continued recording while the rest of us stared into the mine entrance, waiting for the first glimpse of whoever was emerging from the depths. Our flashlights still could not penetrate the darkness effectively, but the sounds indicated that the person should be visible within minutes. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was different from the earlier cutoff of mine sounds. This felt like someone had paused in their climb, perhaps listening for sounds from the surface or resting before completing the ascent to the entrance. We could hear nothing except our own breathing and the wind moving through the abandoned mining equipment. After several minutes of waiting, Marcus called down into the shaft, identifying himself and asking if anyone needed assistance. His voice echoed into the darkness and then returned as a series of diminishing echoes from the tunnel system. No response came from whoever had been climbing toward the surface. Jessica made the decision that we were leaving immediately. The situation had moved beyond normal exploration risks into something that none of us understood or could control safely. We packed our equipment quickly and began the hike back down the mountain toward our vehicles. As we descended the old access road, we could hear activity resuming at the mine behind us. The sounds of picks and shovels striking stone echoed across the mountainside, accompanied by voices that seemed to be shouting instructions or warnings to each other. The sounds continued until we were too far away to hear them clearly, but they persisted for at least an hour after we left the camp. Research into the specific history of the mining camp revealed information that explained our experience but raised even more disturbing questions. According to records from the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum, the camp had been the site of a major accident in 1924 when a tunnel collapse trapped 12 miners underground for 6 days. Rescue efforts were hampered by unstable conditions and the remote location of the camp. By the time rescuers reached the trapped miners, 8 had died from injuries and carbon monoxide poisoning. The 4 survivors reported that they could hear the voices of their dead colleagues continuing to work in the collapsed sections of the mine, apparently unaware that they had been killed. The camp was abandoned immediately after the rescue operation, with the mining company citing unsafe geological conditions and the psychological trauma experienced by surviving workers. Local residents reported hearing sounds of mining activity coming from the abandoned workings for years after the closure, leading to persistent rumors that the dead miners were still trying to complete their work. More disturbing was information we discovered about other exploration teams that had visited the camp in recent decades. 3 separate groups of urban explorers and mining historians had reported similar experiences of hearing voices and footsteps in the mine, always followed by the sensation of being watched or pursued as they left the area. One team had attempted to explore the mine shaft with proper safety equipment, but had been forced to retreat when their lights failed simultaneously, and they heard what sounded like tunnel collapse occurring behind them. Another group reported that their vehicle would not start after visiting the camp, stranding them overnight in the area while sounds of mining activity continued from the abandoned workings. Most significantly, a geological survey team that had visited the camp in the 1980s to assess the stability of the abandoned mine had documented their experience in official reports. Their instruments detected no signs of structural instability or dangerous gases, but multiple team members reported hearing voices and tool sounds coming from sections of the mine that had been sealed since the 1924 collapse. We never returned to the mining camp above Bisbee, and our team dissolved shortly after the expedition. Lisa moved to Oregon to focus on architectural photography. Marcus changed careers to become a museum curator, and Jessica now works for the Forest Service educating people about mine safety. We remain friends, but we no longer discuss what we experienced at the abandoned camp. The Desert Ruins Collective officially ceased operations in August of that year. Some ruins are better left undocumented, and some stories are better left buried in the mountains where they belong. The copper mines of Arizona hold more than geological treasures, and the men who died in those dark tunnels are still trying to finish the work that killed them. My name is Luis, and for 8 years I worked as a property caretaker for wealthy families who own desert estates in the exclusive communities around Scottsdale, Arizona. These sprawling compounds, often exceeding 20 acres, were designed as luxury retreats for their owners who might visit only a few times per year. My job involved maintaining security, overseeing landscaping, managing pool and spa systems, and ensuring that these multi-million-dollar properties remained in perfect condition, regardless of how rarely they were occupied. The Ravencroft estate was different from my other assignments from the moment I accepted the position in April of last year. Located in the foothills north of Scottsdale, the property encompassed 35 acres of pristine Sonoran desert landscape dominated by a modernist mansion that seemed to grow organically from the red rock formations. The architecture was stunning, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the surrounding mountains and valleys. The estate had been designed by a famous architect in the late 1990s for technology entrepreneur Richard Ravencroft and his wife Patricia. According to the property management company that hired me, the Ravencrofts had used the house regularly during the first decade after its completion, entertaining business associates and hosting family gatherings in the luxurious desert setting. However, Patricia Ravencroft had died in a car accident in 2010, and Richard had gradually reduced his visits to the property until he stopped coming entirely around 2018. The estate had been maintained by a series of caretakers over the years, but the position seemed to have unusual turnover rates. I would be the 5th caretaker in 3 years, which should have been a warning sign, but was explained to me as the result of scheduling conflicts and career changes. The previous caretaker, a man named Miguel Santos, had left abruptly in March without giving proper notice or completing his final maintenance reports. The property management company described his departure as unprofessional, but declined to provide specific details about his reasons for leaving. They assured me that all necessary background checks and references had been completed, and that Miguel's departure had nothing to do with working conditions or compensation issues. My responsibilities included daily security patrols of the property perimeter, weekly maintenance of the pool and spa systems, monthly testing of the backup generators and water filtration equipment, and quarterly deep cleaning of the main house and guest facilities. The estate also included a separate caretaker's residence where I would live full-time, a well-equipped workshop for maintenance projects, and a garage housing several vehicles that needed to be started and exercised regularly. The first month of work proceeded without incident. The estate was magnificent, with professionally designed landscaping that showcased native desert plants and water features that created oases of green in the arid environment. The main house was furnished with museum-quality art and furniture, and every system functioned flawlessly thanks to regular professional maintenance and high-quality construction. The isolation of the property was both appealing and occasionally unsettling. The nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away, and the estate was accessible only via a private road that wound through natural desert terrain for several miles before connecting to public highways. During my evening security patrols, I would often go hours without seeing vehicle lights in the distance or hearing any sounds other than the wind and the occasional call of coyotes or great horned owls. It was during one of these evening patrols in early May that I first noticed something unusual about the property's history. While inspecting the perimeter fence near the eastern boundary, I discovered what appeared to be a small cemetery or memorial site hidden among a grove of mature Palo Verde trees. 3 simple stone markers bearing dates from the early 2000s were arranged in a neat row, surrounded by decorative rocks and desert wildflowers that appeared to have been carefully maintained. The markers bore only dates and initials, with no names or other identifying information. The dates suggested that the burials or memorials were relatively recent, occurring during the period when the Ravencrofts were actively using the property. I made a note to ask the property management company about the markers during my next monthly report, assuming they were memorials for beloved family pets that had been buried on the estate. 2 weeks later, while conducting routine maintenance on the backup generator system, I discovered a locked storage room in the basement of the main house that was not included in the facility blueprints or maintenance schedules I had been provided. The door was constructed of heavy steel and secured with an electronic lock that did not respond to the master codes I had been given for other security systems throughout the property. The existence of the locked room bothered me more than it should have, given that wealthy homeowners often maintained private storage areas for valuable collections or sensitive documents. However, the room's absence from official property documentation seemed unusual for a professional maintenance operation, and I began to wonder what other aspects of the estate might not have been disclosed to the caretaking staff. My curiosity was further aroused when I noticed that the ventilation system serving the locked room included expensive air filtration equipment that seemed excessive for simple storage purposes. The filtration units were industrial grade, designed to handle biological contaminants rather than dust or moisture that might affect stored valuables. The electrical consumption meters for the locked room also indicated power usage patterns, consistent with refrigeration equipment rather than static storage. During my second month on the property, I began finding personal items scattered in various locations around the estate that suggested previous caretakers had left more hastily than the property management company had indicated. A work jacket with Miguel embroidered on the pocket was found in the workshop, along with personal tools that seemed too valuable to abandon voluntarily. In the caretaker's residence, I discovered prescription medications and family photographs left behind in dresser drawers, again suggesting sudden departure rather than planned resignation. Most disturbing was a journal I found hidden beneath the bathroom sink in the caretaker's residence. The journal belonged to Miguel Santos and contained increasingly agitated entries documenting his experiences during his final weeks on the property. According to Miguel's notes, he had discovered evidence that the Ravencroft estate was being used for purposes that had nothing to do with luxury recreation or business entertainment. Miguel's journal entries described finding human hair and fingernails in the basement drainage systems, discovering clothing and personal items that appeared to belong to multiple different people hidden throughout the property, and hearing sounds from the locked storage room that suggested the presence of living people rather than stored valuables. His final entry, dated just 3 days before his disappearance, stated that he had contacted authorities but that his reports had been dismissed due to his legal status as an undocumented immigrant. The implications of Miguel's journal were horrifying, but I initially tried to dismiss his accounts as paranoid fantasies or misinterpretations of innocent circumstances. Wealthy property owners often had eccentric collections or unusual business arrangements that might seem suspicious to outside observers. However, as I continued working on the property, I began to notice details that supported Miguel's concerns. The basement of the main house contained sophisticated soundproofing that seemed excessive for a residential wine cellar or entertainment area. The ventilation system included features designed to prevent odors from escaping to other parts of the building. Most unsettling, the drainage systems throughout the basement showed signs of recent heavy use and chemical cleaning that went far beyond normal maintenance requirements. During my 3rd month on the property, I gained access to the locked storage room through a combination of electronic surveillance and careful observation of delivery personnel who occasionally visited the estate. The room contained equipment and facilities that confirmed my worst suspicions about the property's true purpose. The storage room had been converted into what could only be described as a makeshift medical facility, complete with surgical equipment, restraining devices, and refrigeration units that were clearly not designed for food storage. Documentation found in filing cabinets indicated that the facility had been used for procedures that had nothing to do with legitimate medical practice and everything to do with human trafficking and organ harvesting. The most damning evidence was a collection of identification documents, photographs, and personal items that belonged to dozens of different people who had apparently been brought to the estate against their will. The victims appeared to be primarily undocumented immigrants and homeless individuals who would not be immediately missed by authorities or family members. Financial records hidden in the medical facility indicated that Richard Ravencroft had been operating an international organ trafficking network that used the isolated desert estate as a processing center. Wealthy clients from around the world would travel to Arizona under the cover of medical tourism, while victims were brought to the property and held in the converted basement facilities until their organs could be harvested and transplanted. The stone markers I had discovered during my first week on the property were not memorials for beloved pets, but grave sites for victims whose organs had been harvested and whose bodies had been disposed of on the estate grounds. The dates on the markers corresponded with periods of increased activity at the medical facility, suggesting that the operation had been ongoing for over a decade before Patricia Ravencroft's death had forced a temporary suspension. The journal entries I found in the medical facility indicated that operations had resumed in recent years under the supervision of medical professionals who traveled to Arizona specifically to perform the illegal procedures. The facility had been designed to handle multiple victims simultaneously, with recovery areas for transplant recipients and disposal systems for biological waste that ensured no evidence would remain on the property. Most horrifying was the discovery that several recent victims were still being held in hidden chambers beneath the main medical facility. The basement had been excavated to create a multi-level complex that extended far deeper into the desert floor than the original house plans indicated. Sound from these lower levels was completely isolated from the rest of the property, explaining why previous caretakers had taken months to discover the full scope of the operation. I immediately contacted federal authorities, providing them with detailed documentation of the organ trafficking facility and information about the victims still being held on the property. The FBI raid that followed resulted in the rescue of 7 people who were being held for future organ harvesting, along with the arrest of medical personnel and security staff who had been operating the facility. Richard Ravencroft was arrested at his primary residence in California and charged with multiple federal crimes related to human trafficking, kidnapping, and murder. The investigation revealed that his technology business had served primarily as a money laundering operation for the organ trafficking network, which had generated millions of dollars in revenue over more than 15 years of operation. The bodies of at least 37 victims were eventually recovered from various burial sites throughout the property, though investigators believe the actual number of deaths may have been significantly higher. Many victims had been cremated using industrial equipment hidden in the property's maintenance buildings, leaving no physical evidence of their murders. The previous caretakers who had left the property abruptly had not resigned voluntarily or been dismissed for performance issues. According to federal investigators, at least 3 former caretakers had been murdered when they discovered evidence of the organ trafficking operation. Their bodies were among those found in the desert burial sites, and their disappearances had been covered up through falsified employment records and forged resignation letters. Miguel Santos was found alive but severely traumatized in a medical facility in Mexico, where he had fled after discovering the true nature of the Ravencroft estate. His journal had been accurate in every detail, and his decision to leave the country immediately after contacting authorities had probably saved his life. Federal prosecutors credited his documentation with providing crucial evidence for the successful prosecution of the trafficking network. The Ravencroft estate has been seized by federal authorities and will eventually be sold to compensate victims' families and fund anti-trafficking enforcement efforts. The main house and all associated buildings have been demolished to prevent the site from becoming a morbid tourist attraction, and the desert land will be donated to conservation organizations. The property management company that hired me was revealed to be a front organization created specifically to provide cover for the trafficking operation and to recruit caretakers who could be monitored and controlled. Several company executives were arrested and charged with conspiracy, and the organization was permanently shut down by federal authorities. I no longer work as a property caretaker and have moved to a different state to escape the trauma of my experiences at the Ravencroft estate. The isolation and luxury that initially attracted me to the job were revealed to be tools used to hide unspeakable crimes against vulnerable people who had no one to protect them. The Arizona desert holds many secrets, but some properties are abandoned for reasons that have nothing to do with economics or changing lifestyles. Sometimes the most beautiful places conceal the darkest purposes, and sometimes the people who maintain these properties pay with their lives for discovering the truth. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, because the wealthy and powerful are capable of horrors that most people cannot imagine, especially when they believe their money and isolation make them untouchable. My name is Jennifer, and until last September I was a traveling nurse working contracts across Arizona and New Mexico. The job required long drives between assignments, often through remote stretches of highway where you might not see another vehicle for hours. I had driven those desert roads hundreds of times over the past 5 years, and I thought I understood their rhythms and dangers. I was wrong about what lurked on the highways between Phoenix and Flagstaff. The incident occurred on State Route 87, a 2-lane highway that cuts through some of the most desolate country in central Arizona. It was a Tuesday night in late September, and I was driving from a completed assignment in Phoenix to start a new contract at Flagstaff Medical Center. The shift change meant I had to drive overnight to arrive in time for orientation at 7 a.m. I had taken this route dozens of times before. During daylight hours, Route 87 offers stunning views of the Sonoran Desert transitioning into high country pines. At night, however, it becomes a ribbon of asphalt through absolute darkness, with the occasional pair of animal eyes reflecting in the headlights being the only signs of life for miles. The highway has a reputation among locals and frequent travelers. It was constructed in 1927 with sharp curves and steep grades that make night driving challenging under the best conditions. Over the decades, countless fatal accidents have occurred along its length, earning it recognition as one of Arizona's most dangerous roads. Emergency responders call certain sections blood alleys because of the frequency and severity of crashes. I departed Phoenix at 11 p.m., planning to arrive in Flagstaff around 2:30 a.m. with time to grab a hotel room and a few hours of sleep before reporting to work. The first hour of driving passed uneventfully. Traffic was light, consisting mainly of long-haul truckers and the occasional late-night traveler like myself. The radio played softly and I maintained a steady speed while staying alert for wildlife that might wander into the roadway. Around mile marker 200, approximately 30 miles south of Payson, the landscape began its transition from low desert to pine forest. This section of highway features several tight curves and elevation changes that require careful attention, especially at night. I had navigated these curves countless times and felt confident in my familiarity with the road. That confidence evaporated at 12:47 a.m. when my headlights illuminated what appeared to be a serious traffic accident directly ahead. A white sedan was positioned sideways across both lanes of the highway, its driver's side severely damaged and partially crumpled. The front of the vehicle was smashed inward and the windshield had spiderwebbed into an opaque pattern that obscured the interior. Steam or smoke rose from under the hood, creating ghostly wisps in the cold desert air. The passenger side door hung open and debris was scattered across the asphalt. I immediately applied my brakes and activated my hazard lights while scanning for other vehicles or signs of emergency responders. The accident appeared fresh, with no emergency vehicles on scene and no other traffic visible in either direction. My nursing training kicked in automatically and I began mentally preparing to provide medical assistance to any injured parties. As I brought my car to a complete stop approximately 50 feet from the wreckage, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with unease. Despite the severity of the damage, there were no skid marks on the pavement leading up to the accident site. The asphalt was completely clean, with no indication of the violent braking or loss of control that should have preceded such a devastating crash. I reached for my cell phone to call 911 and discovered that I had no signal, which was not unusual in this remote area. Many sections of Route 87 had spotty cellular coverage, and emergency calls sometimes had to be made from the next town or truck stop. I would need to either render immediate aid to any victims or drive to the nearest location with phone service to report the accident. I grabbed my emergency medical kit from the trunk and approached the damaged vehicle cautiously. My headlights provided the only illumination, creating stark shadows that moved and shifted as I walked closer to the wreckage. The silence was complete except for the ticking of cooling metal and the soft hiss of escaping fluids. The scene became more disturbing the closer I got. The damage pattern on the sedan made no sense from an engineering perspective. The impacts appeared to have come from multiple directions simultaneously, as if the vehicle had been crushed by some enormous force rather than colliding with another object. The metal was twisted in ways that defied the normal physics of automobile accidents. Looking through the shattered windows, I could see that the interior of the car was empty. No driver, no passengers, no personal belongings scattered by the impact. The seats were pristine despite the external damage, and there was no blood or other evidence that anyone had been injured in the crash. Even more unsettling, the car keys were still in the ignition, and the engine was running despite the extensive damage to the front end. I circled the vehicle looking for clues about what had happened or where the occupants might have gone. The passenger door that hung open showed no signs of being forced or damaged during the crash. It appeared to have been open normally, as if someone had simply stepped out of the vehicle after parking. But there were no footprints in the sandy soil beside the highway and no indication of where the driver might have gone for help. The license plate was clearly visible and appeared current, though something about the numbers and letters seemed wrong in a way I could not immediately identify. The registration sticker looked fresh, but when I leaned closer to read the dates, the numbers seemed to shift and blur as if they were printed on water rather than static material. As I completed my examination of the vehicle, I became aware that I was no longer alone on the highway. A figure was walking toward me from the direction of Payson, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had been traveling on foot for a considerable distance. As the person drew closer, illuminated by my headlights, I could see it was a woman in her 30s wearing a pale blue dress and carrying a small purse. She appeared completely calm despite the circumstances, showing no signs of injury or distress that would be expected from someone involved in such a severe accident. Her clothes were clean and undamaged, her hair neatly arranged, and her expression was serene in a way that felt completely inappropriate for the situation. "Thank goodness someone stopped," she said in a voice that carried clearly through the desert air despite the distance between us. "I have been trying to get help for such a long time." She gestured toward the wrecked sedan as if it were merely an inconvenience rather than a potentially fatal accident. I introduced myself and explained that I was a nurse who could provide medical assistance if needed. I asked if she had been in the vehicle and whether she was injured, while internally cataloging the complete absence of trauma symptoms that should have been present if she had survived such a devastating crash. "Oh, I was not hurt," she replied, continuing to approach with that same unhurried pace. "But my husband is still trapped inside. He cannot get out on his own, and I do not have the strength to help him." She pointed toward the sedan, which I had just thoroughly examined and found to be completely empty. I looked back at the vehicle, confused by her statement. The interior was clearly vacant, with no signs that anyone had been trapped inside or extracted by emergency responders. I asked her to clarify what she meant, wondering if there had been a second vehicle involved in the accident that I had somehow missed. "He is right there in the driver's seat," she said with growing urgency. "Please, you have to help him get out before it gets worse." She was close enough now that I could see her face clearly in my headlights, and what I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. Her skin had a waxy, translucent quality that seemed to glow with its own pale light. Her eyes were completely white, with no visible pupils or irises, and they reflected my headlights like mirrors. When she spoke, I could see that her mouth moved normally, but the voice seemed to come from somewhere else entirely, as if she were lip-syncing to words spoken by someone standing behind me. I backed toward my vehicle while keeping my eyes on both the woman and the wrecked sedan. As I watched, the interior of the damaged car began to change. A figure materialized in the driver's seat, slumped forward against the steering wheel. The man appeared to be unconscious, with blood running down his face from a head injury. His clothes were torn and stained, and his breathing was labored and irregular. "You see him now," the woman said with satisfaction. "He has been waiting so long for someone to help. All you have to do is reach inside and pull him free." She gestured toward the open passenger door with hands that seemed to have too many fingers, all of them unnaturally long and pale. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get back in my car and drive away as quickly as possible. Nothing about this situation made logical sense, and my nursing experience told me that trauma victims do not simply materialize inside vehicles that had been empty moments before. But the professional part of my mind insisted that I had a duty to help if someone was truly injured. I approached the passenger door cautiously while keeping the woman in my peripheral vision. The man in the driver's seat looked real enough, and his injuries appeared severe. If this was some kind of hallucination brought on by stress or fatigue, the responsible thing to do was still to investigate and ensure that no one actually needed medical assistance. As I reached toward the door handle, the woman spoke again. "Hurry," she urged. He is running out of time. If you do not help him soon, he will end up like all the others who have waited too long on this road." The interior of the vehicle felt ice cold when I leaned inside, despite the warm September night. The injured man did not respond when I called to him or touched his shoulder. His skin was frigid and had the waxy texture I had noticed on the woman's face. When I checked for a pulse at his wrist, I found nothing, and his chest was not rising and falling with breath. I jerked my hand back and turned to tell the woman that the man was already dead and beyond help. But she was no longer standing where I had left her. Instead, she was sitting in the passenger seat of my own vehicle, smiling at me through the windshield with those terrible white eyes. I ran to my car and yanked open the driver's door, but the passenger seat was empty. The woman had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. I started the engine with shaking hands and drove away from the accident scene as fast as the curving highway would allow, not caring about speed limits or safe following distances. When I reached Payson 20 minutes later, I stopped at the first gas station I could find and called 911 to report the accident. The dispatcher took my information and assured me that emergency responders would investigate the scene immediately. I provided the exact mile marker location and a detailed description of the damaged white sedan blocking both lanes of traffic. The next morning, after completing my shift orientation at the hospital, I called the Arizona Department of Public Safety to follow up on the accident report. The dispatcher, I spoke with checked their records thoroughly before informing me that no accidents had been reported on Route 87 the previous night. Emergency crews had not responded to any calls in the area I described, and no abandoned or damaged vehicles had been found. Curious and increasingly disturbed, I drove back to mile marker 200 during daylight hours. The section of highway where I had encountered the wrecked sedan and its impossible occupants was completely clear. No debris, no skid marks, no signs that any accident had occurred there recently or in the distant past. Research into the history of that particular stretch of Route 87 revealed that it had indeed been the site of multiple fatal accidents over the decades, including a head-on collision in 1994 that killed a married couple driving a white sedan. According to newspaper reports, the husband had been trapped in the wreckage while his wife wandered the highway in shock, trying unsuccessfully to flag down help before she also succumbed to her injuries. The accident had occurred at exactly mile marker 200, and the victims had been found the next morning by a passing truck driver. The investigation determined that the couple had been dead for several hours before they were discovered, meaning they had spent their final moments alone on the dark highway, waiting for assistance that arrived too late. I no longer drive Route 87 at night, and I have changed my work schedule to avoid overnight assignments that require long-distance travel through remote areas. Some accidents, it seems, continue to happen long after the original victims have died, and some people continue to wait for help that can never actually save them. The desert highways of Arizona hold more than just the living, and not every accident scene you encounter will exist in the same reality you inhabit. My name is Tyler, and until 8 months ago I was a regular weekend warrior who thought the greatest dangers in the Arizona desert came from rattlesnakes and heat exhaustion. I grew up in Phoenix and had been camping in the Sonoran Desert since I was a teenager, exploring areas from the Superstition Mountains to the remote washes around Cave Creek. I believed I understood the rhythms and risks of desert survival. That confidence vanished during a March camping trip when my friends and I encountered something that had been hunting in the Cave Creek area for much longer than any of us realized. The group consisted of myself and 3 college friends who had maintained our tradition of monthly camping trips even as we entered our 30s and started families. Jake worked in finance, Mike was a high school teacher, and Danny had recently started his own construction business. We were experienced outdoorsmen who prided ourselves on proper preparation and respect for the wilderness. Cave Creek stretches through some of the most pristine Sonoran desert landscape in central Arizona, about 40 miles north of Phoenix. The area is famous for its saguaro cacti, ancient petroglyphs, and diverse wildlife that includes javelinas, coyotes, mountain lions, and various species of rattlesnakes. We had camped in the region dozens of times over the years, always following established backcountry protocols and leave-no-trace principles. For this particular trip, we had selected a campsite approximately 5 miles from the main Cave Creek Road, accessible only by high-clearance vehicle and a challenging hike through rocky terrain. The location offered complete solitude and spectacular views of the surrounding mountains and valleys. We planned to spend 3 days exploring lesser-known canyons and photographing the abundant wildlife. The first day passed without incident. We set up our tents in a natural clearing surrounded by mature mesquite trees and towering saguaros, established a proper fire ring with gathered deadwood, and prepared a dinner of freeze-dried meals and fresh vegetables we had packed in coolers. The weather was perfect for March camping, with daytime temperatures in the mid-70s and nighttime lows expected to drop into the 40s. As darkness fell, we built a modest campfire and settled into our usual routine of sharing stories and planning the next day's activities. The desert night sounds were familiar and comforting. The distant yipping of coyotes, the occasional hoot of a great horned owl, and the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush in search of food and water. Around 10 p.m., however, the normal night sounds began to change in subtle ways that initially escaped our conscious notice. The coyote calls became less frequent and eventually stopped entirely. The owl went silent. Even the constant chirping of insects seemed to fade until the desert around our campsite felt unnaturally quiet. Jake was the first to comment on the silence. "Anyone else notice how quiet it got out there?" he asked, gesturing toward the darkness beyond our fire circle. We all paused to listen, and the absence of normal desert sounds was indeed striking. "Maybe we spooked the wildlife when we set up camp," Mike suggested, though we had been in the area for hours and the animals should have resumed their normal activities. Danny, who had the most hunting experience among us, shook his head. "No, this is different. When animals go quiet like this, it usually means there is a predator in the area. Something big enough that everything else wants to hide from it." As if summoned by his words, a sound drifted through the night that none of us had ever heard before. It started as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but it modulated into something that resembled vocalization. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something that combined elements of both in a way that raised the hair on the back of our necks. The sound came from somewhere to the north of our campsite, perhaps half a mile away based on its volume and clarity. It lasted for approximately 10 seconds before fading into silence, leaving us staring at each other around the fire with expressions of confusion and growing unease. "Mountain lion?" Jake asked hopefully, though we all knew that mountain lion vocalization sounded nothing like what we had just heard. Danny shook his head again. "I have heard plenty of mountain lions. That was not a mountain lion. I do not know what that was, but it was big." We decided to maintain our normal camping routine while staying alert for further sounds. The fire provided both light and psychological comfort, and we agreed to keep it burning throughout the night rather than letting it die down as we usually did. We also moved our food storage containers closer to the tents and double-checked that everything was properly secured. The second occurrence happened around midnight as we were preparing to sleep. This time, the sound was closer, perhaps 200 yards from our campsite, and it was accompanied by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the desert vegetation. We could hear branches breaking and rocks being displaced, as if a very heavy creature was making its way through terrain that offered little concealment. Mike grabbed a powerful flashlight and swept its beam in the direction of the sounds, but the light penetrated only 30 or 40 yards into the darkness before being absorbed by the dense vegetation. Whatever was making the noise remained beyond the reach of our illumination, though we could hear it pause when the light swept in its direction, as if it were aware of our observation. "We need to make a decision here," Danny said quietly. "Do we pack up and leave, or do we stick it out until morning?" The practical part of me wanted to retreat to the safety of our vehicles and drive back to civilization, but none of us wanted to admit that we were being driven away by unknown sounds in the night. We compromised by setting up a watch schedule, with one person remaining awake and alert while the others slept in shifts. I took the first watch, armed with the brightest flashlight we had and a large knife that would be useless against any serious threat, but provided some psychological comfort. During my 2-hour watch, I heard the creature moving around our campsite in what appeared to be a wide circle, always staying just beyond the range of my flashlight. The sound suggested something much larger than any native Arizona predator, moving with surprising stealth considering its apparent size. Occasionally I would catch glimpses of what might have been eye shine reflecting my light, but never clearly enough to identify the source. Jake's watch passed without major incident, though he reported hearing what sounded like breathing or panting from somewhere in the darkness. Mike's watch brought the most disturbing development yet: tracks. When dawn broke and we could examine our surroundings in daylight, we found footprints in the sandy areas around our campsite that defied easy explanation. The tracks were roughly humanoid in shape, but much larger than any human foot, measuring approximately 18 inches in length. They showed distinct toe impressions and what appeared to be claw marks, though they were not consistent with known bear or mountain lion track patterns. The tracks formed a clear circuit around our campsite, maintaining a consistent distance of about 50 yards from our tents. Whatever had made them had spent considerable time observing us during the night, walking in a pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random animal behavior. More disturbing than the tracks themselves was what we found in one of the clearer impressions. At the heel of the largest footprint, embedded in the sand, was a piece of bone that appeared to be from a human hand. The bone was old and weathered, bleached white by sun exposure, but unmistakably human in origin. We photographed the tracks and the bone fragment before packing our gear as quickly as possible. None of us spoke much during the breakdown process, but we were all thinking the same thing. We needed to leave the area immediately and report our findings to the appropriate authorities. The drive back to Cave Creek Road seemed to take forever, though it was the same route we had used to enter the area. Every shadow seemed to conceal potential threats, and we found ourselves checking the mirrors constantly for signs of pursuit. It was an irrational fear, but the previous night had shattered our confidence in our understanding of what lived in the Arizona wilderness. Once we reached cell phone coverage, we contacted the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office to report the unusual tracks and the human bone fragment. The deputy who took our report was professional but clearly skeptical, noting that bone fragments in the desert were not unusual, and that track identification could be difficult even for experienced outdoorsmen. However, when we showed him the photographs we had taken, his demeanor changed noticeably. He asked detailed questions about the exact location of our campsite and requested copies of all the images. He also advised us not to return to the area alone and to report any similar encounters immediately. Research into the history of the Cave Creek area revealed that it had been considered sacred territory by several Native American tribes, including the Tohono O'odham, who had specific warnings about creatures that hunted in the desert darkness. According to tribal tradition, certain areas of the Sonoran Desert were home to entities that were not entirely animal or human, beings that had existed since before the arrival of European settlers. The Tohono O'odham had specific protocols for traveling through these areas, including never camping alone and always maintaining fires throughout the night. They spoke of creatures that could mimic human voices and would attempt to lure travelers away from their groups. And they warned that these beings had an appetite for human flesh that had developed over centuries of feeding. Most significantly, the tribal warnings specifically mentioned the Cave Creek area as a place where such entities gathered during certain times of the year, drawn by the abundance of water and the natural corridors that allowed them to move undetected between different hunting territories. We never returned to that specific campsite, though we continued our regular camping trips in other areas of Arizona. However, none of us could shake the feeling that we had encountered something that challenged our understanding of what lived in the American Southwest. The tracks we photographed remain unexplained, and the bone fragment was never identified by the authorities. 6 months after our Cave Creek encounter, Danny disappeared during a solo camping trip in the Superstition Mountains. His vehicle was found at a trailhead, and his campsite was located 2 days later, but Danny himself was never found. The search teams discovered tracks around his abandoned camp that were remarkably similar to what we had photographed at Cave Creek. The official investigation concluded that Danny had probably become lost and succumbed to exposure, a common tragedy in the unforgiving Arizona wilderness. But Jake, Mike, and I know better. We know that something hunts in the desert darkness, something that has learned to be patient and selective in choosing its prey. The Tohono O'odham warnings were not folklore or superstition. They were survival instructions passed down through generations by people who understood that the Sonoran Desert holds secrets that are older and more dangerous than any modern camper realizes. My name is Derek, and until 6 months ago I worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour grocery store in Tucson. Most people think overnight retail is easy money, but they have never experienced the strange parade of humanity that emerges after midnight in the desert. I had been working there for 3 years, long enough to recognize the regulars. The insomniacs buying ice cream at 2 a.m., the hospital workers grabbing energy drinks between shifts, the construction crews stocking up before dawn. But there was one customer who defied every pattern I thought I understood about late-night shoppers. She first appeared on a Tuesday in October, precisely at 3:33 a.m. I remember the exact time because our system automatically logs every transaction, and something about her visit felt significant enough that I checked afterward. She was an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and wearing a faded floral dress that looked like it belonged to another decade. Her skin had that papery quality that comes with extreme age, but her eyes were sharp and focused in a way that made me uncomfortable. She moved through the store with purpose, selecting the same items every single time: a gallon of whole milk, a loaf of white bread, a package of ground beef, a bag of carrots, a box of salt, and finally a single red candle from the seasonal aisle. The order never varied, not once. She would place each item carefully in her cart, moving with deliberate precision through the empty aisles while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. At first, I assumed she was just another creature of habit. Plenty of elderly customers develop rigid routines. But as weeks passed, her visits became more unsettling. She never spoke beyond the bare minimum required for the transaction. When I would greet her or ask how her night was going, she would simply stare at me with those piercing eyes and nod once. Her silence felt heavy, loaded with meaning I could not decipher. The strange thing was how she paid, always exact change, always the same crumpled bills and worn coins, as if she had been carrying the same money for decades. The bills were old, some dating back to the 1980s, and they smelled of dust and something else I could never identify. Something organic and unpleasant that lingered on my fingers after handling them. But what really started to bother me was her consistency. Every night she worked, Tuesday through Saturday, she would appear at exactly 3:33 a.m. Not 3:32, not 3:34, always 3:33, like she was following some invisible schedule that demanded absolute precision. I began watching the clock during my shifts, waiting for her arrival with a mixture of curiosity and growing dread. After about 2 months of these visits, I decided to break the pattern. When she approached my register one November night, I tried to engage her in conversation. "You must be quite the early riser," I said with forced cheerfulness. "Shopping before dawn every day." She stopped placing items on the conveyor belt and looked directly at me. Her eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they seemed to look through me rather than at me. "I am preparing," she said in a voice that sounded like rustling papers. "The others will be hungry soon." I rang up her items as quickly as possible, suddenly eager to complete the transaction. But as I handed her the receipt, she grabbed my wrist with fingers that felt like ice. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone her age. "You have kind eyes," she whispered. "When the time comes, remember that kindness." Then she released me and walked away, pushing her cart through the automatic doors into the desert night. Sleep became difficult after that encounter. During my days off, I found myself researching the store's history, trying to understand what she might have meant. The building had been constructed in the 1970s on what was previously undeveloped desert land. Before that, according to old county records, the area had been part of a larger ranch that was abandoned during the Great Depression. I could not find anything that explained her cryptic warning or her obsession with shopping at such a specific time. December brought a change in her routine that made everything worse. She still arrived at 3:33 a.m., still bought the same items in the same order. But now, she was not alone. 3 other elderly people began accompanying her. An old man in a worn suit that looked decades out of style. Another woman in a nurse's uniform that had yellowed with age. A third figure whose gender I could never determine, always wearing a long coat that obscured their features. They never spoke to each other or to me. They simply followed her through the store like a silent procession, each pushing their own cart and selecting identical items. Milk, bread, ground beef, carrots, salt, and red candles. The same exact purchases multiplied by 4. The checkout process became surreal, scanning the same products over and over while 4 pairs of ancient eyes watched me work. The smell grew stronger with more of them present. That organic, unpleasant odor that seemed to cling to their old money and permeate the air around them. It reminded me of something rotting in the desert heat, sweet and sickening. I started wearing a mask during my shifts, claiming allergies just to filter out the stench. By January, their group had grown to 6 people, then 8, then 12, all elderly, all dressed in clothing that seemed frozen in different decades, all maintaining that same eerie silence while they moved through the store in perfect synchronization. The automatic doors would slide open at exactly 3:33 a.m., and they would enter like ghosts materializing from the Arizona night. I began dreading their visits. My manager noticed my request to switch shifts, but overnight positions were hard to fill and I needed the job. I tried convincing myself that they were just a large family with unusual shopping habits. Maybe they lived in a senior community nearby. Maybe they were part of some religious group with specific dietary requirements. Any explanation was better than confronting the growing certainty that something fundamentally wrong was happening in my store every night. The breaking point came on a February morning when their group had swelled to nearly 20 people. As always, they arrived at 3:33 a.m., moving through the aisles with that same deliberate purpose. But this time, as the first woman approached my register, she spoke again. "Tonight is the last night," she said in that papery voice. "Tomorrow we begin the feast." I scanned her items with trembling hands, trying to process what she had said. "What feast?" I managed to ask. She smiled for the first time since I had known her, revealing teeth that looked too sharp and too white for her age. "The Feast of Remembrance," she replied, "for all those who were forgotten in the desert, all those who died with empty stomachs and unfulfilled hunger." As I handed her the receipt, she leaned closer. Her breath smelled like turned earth and old bones. "You have been chosen to witness," she whispered. "Because of your kindness, you will understand what we have become." Then she turned and walked away, leading her silent procession back into the night. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that. When I finally returned to work, my manager informed me that the overnight shift was being discontinued due to low customer traffic. The store would now close at midnight and reopen at 6 a.m. When I asked about our late-night regulars, he looked confused. "What regulars?" he said. "The night shift barely had any customers. That is why we are shutting it down." I checked the transaction logs for the previous months, searching for evidence of their purchases. There was nothing. No record of the milk, bread, ground beef, carrots, salt, or candles. No receipts matching their visits. According to the computer system, the store had been virtually empty during those overnight hours. But I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. And sometimes when I drive past that store late at night, I see figures moving through the parking lot at exactly 3:33 a.m. They carry shopping bags filled with provisions for a feast that exists somewhere between memory and hunger, between the living world and whatever lies beyond it in the vast Arizona desert. I work day shifts now at a different store across town. But I still wake up at 3:33 a.m., remembering the weight of their ancient eyes and the promise of kindness in a world where the forgotten dead still need to eat. My name is Carlos, and for 3 years I worked as a security guard at London Bridge in Lake Havasu City, Arizona. Most people know the bridge's history, how it was purchased from England in 1968 and transported stone by stone to Arizona, where it was reconstructed over the Colorado River. What fewer people understand is that some things from Victorian London made the journey along with the bridge itself, things that were never meant to cross an ocean or survive in the Arizona desert. Lake Havasu City was created specifically around the relocated London Bridge as a tourist destination and retirement community. The bridge spans a channel of the Colorado River, connecting the mainland to a small island that houses shops, restaurants, and the London Bridge Resort. During peak season, thousands of visitors cross the bridge daily, taking photographs and marveling at this piece of authentic British architecture transplanted into the American Southwest. My job as a security guard involved monitoring the bridge and surrounding areas from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., when foot traffic was minimal and most businesses were closed. The work was generally routine, consisting mainly of deterring vandalism, preventing people from climbing on the bridge structure, and ensuring that the lighting systems remained functional throughout the night. The bridge is beautiful during daylight hours, with its stone arches reflecting in the Colorado River and the distant mountains providing a dramatic backdrop. At night, however, it takes on a completely different character. Architectural lighting illuminates the Victorian stonework, creating deep shadows between the lampposts and transforming the familiar tourist attraction into something that feels much older and more mysterious than its 1970s reconstruction would suggest. During my first month on the job, I attributed the strange atmosphere to my unfamiliarity with working alone in such a historically significant location. The bridge was originally built in London in 1831, and it had witnessed over a century of Thames River crossings before its relocation to Arizona. It seemed natural that such an ancient structure would feel different from modern buildings, especially during the quiet hours of the night shift. The first incident occurred on a Thursday night in November, approximately 6 weeks after I began working. I was making my routine patrol across the bridge around 2:30 a.m. when I noticed a woman standing at the center span, leaning against the stone parapet and looking down at the water. This was not unusual in itself, as people sometimes came to the bridge late at night for romantic moments or quiet contemplation. However, something about the woman's appearance struck me as wrong for the time period and weather conditions. She was wearing what appeared to be a long Victorian dress, complete with bustles and elaborate trim that seemed authentic rather than costume-like. Her hair was arranged in an intricate style that belonged to the 19th century, and she wore no modern jewelry or accessories that I could see. More concerning was her behavior. She was not simply admiring the view or taking photographs. Instead, she appeared to be preparing to climb over the parapet, positioning her hands on the stone ledge in a way that suggested she intended to jump into the river below. I approached her immediately, identifying myself as security and asking if she needed assistance. She turned toward me with a face that was pale beyond what could be explained by the bridge lighting, and her eyes held an expression of desperate sadness that seemed to encompass more grief than any single person should be able to carry. "He promised to meet me here," she said in an accent that was distinctly British and belonged to no contemporary regional dialect I had ever heard. "He said we would be together, but he has not come. I cannot wait any longer." I tried to engage her in conversation while moving closer, following the suicide prevention protocols I had learned during security training. I asked her name, tried to understand what she was waiting for, and offered to call someone who could help her with whatever problem she was facing. "My name is Margaret," she replied, "and I have been waiting for Henry since 1888. He was supposed to meet me at the bridge so we could start our new life together, but he never came. I cannot bear the waiting anymore." As she spoke, I realized that despite the clear night air, I could see my breath when I exhaled, as if the temperature had dropped dramatically in the area immediately around her. The cold seemed to emanate from her presence, creating a pocket of winter air that extended perhaps 10 feet in all directions. I was close enough now to see details that made my rational mind struggle to process what I was witnessing. Her skin had a translucent quality that seemed to glow with its own pale light. Her Victorian dress appeared to be made of expensive fabric, but it was stained with what looked like river water and showed signs of significant deterioration. Most disturbing were her eyes, which reflected the bridge lights like mirrors but seemed to contain no pupils or iris structures. When she blinked, which she did very rarely, her eyelids moved with mechanical precision that looked unnatural in a living person. "Margaret," I said carefully, "this is Arizona, not London. The year is 2023, not 1888. I think you might be confused about where you are." She smiled sadly and shook her head. "The Thames, the Colorado River, it makes no difference now. Water is water and drowning is drowning. The bridge brought me here, and the bridge will take me to where Henry is waiting." Before I could react, she climbed onto the parapet with fluid grace that defied both gravity and the restrictive nature of her Victorian clothing. She stood balanced on the narrow stone ledge, her dress billowing in a wind that I could not feel, and looked back at me with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thank you for listening," she said. "It has been so long since anyone acknowledged that I exist." Then she stepped forward and fell toward the water below. I rushed to the parapet and looked down, expecting to see her body in the river and preparing to call for emergency rescue services. But there was nothing. No splash, no ripples, no sign that anyone had entered the water. Margaret had simply vanished between the bridge and the river's surface. I reported the incident to my supervisor, describing it as a possible attempted suicide that I had been unable to prevent. A search of the river and surrounding shoreline found no evidence that anyone had jumped from the bridge, and security cameras reviewing the footage from that night showed me patrolling alone, with no other person visible anywhere on the bridge during the time I claimed to have witnessed Margaret's jump. My supervisor was understanding but suggested that the stress of working alone at night might be causing hallucinations or waking dreams. He arranged for me to have a few days off and recommended that I see a counselor if the experiences continued. But they did continue. Over the following months, I encountered Margaret on the bridge approximately once every 2 weeks, always late at night and always during the same tragic ritual. She would be waiting for Henry, express her despair at his absence, and ultimately jump to her death in waters that never received her body. Research into the history of the original London Bridge revealed that it had indeed been a popular suicide location during the Victorian era, with dozens of documented cases of people ending their lives by jumping into the Thames. Among the recorded suicides was a woman named Margaret Whitmore, who jumped from the bridge in December of 1888 after being abandoned by her fiancé, Henry Pemberton. According to newspaper accounts from the time, Margaret had sold all her possessions to purchase passage to America, where Henry had promised to meet her and begin their new life together. When he failed to arrive at their appointed meeting place, she spent her last money on lodging near the bridge and waited for 2 weeks before finally giving up hope. The circumstances of her death were particularly tragic because Henry had actually arrived in London looking for her, but had been delayed by a family emergency and arrived at their meeting place one day after Margaret's suicide. He spent the rest of his life consumed by guilt and grief, eventually taking his own life from the same bridge location in 1891. More disturbing was what I learned about other relocated historical structures. Researchers who study paranormal activity in transplanted buildings have documented numerous cases where supernatural phenomena appear to transfer along with the physical materials. Spirits that were anchored to specific locations often remain attached to the stones, wood, or metal that comprised their earthly connection points. The London Bridge was not simply moved from England to Arizona. It was dismantled stone by stone, with each piece carefully numbered and catalogued, before being shipped across the Atlantic Ocean and reconstructed in its new location. If Margaret's spirit had been bound to the bridge itself rather than to its geographic location, the reconstruction process would have brought her to Lake Havasu City along with the Victorian stonework. During my final months working bridge security, I began to notice that Margaret was not alone. Other figures from different time periods occasionally appeared on the bridge during night hours, always in distress and always reenacting moments of tragedy from the bridge's London history. A man in Victorian formal wear would pace back and forth, apparently searching for someone who never appeared. A woman in Edwardian dress would stand weeping at the same spot where Margaret jumped. Most unnervingly, I began to see a figure that matched historical descriptions of Jack the Ripper, a tall man in a dark coat who would appear in the shadows between lampposts and seemed to be stalking the other spirits. He never approached me directly, but his presence filled the air with a sense of malevolent hunting that made every night shift feel like a survival exercise. The final incident that convinced me to find different employment occurred on a February night, when the temperature had dropped into the 40s, unusually cold for Lake Havasu City. I encountered Margaret as usual, went through our familiar conversation and watched her prepare to jump from the parapet. But this time, as she stepped forward, she turned back to me and spoke words that still haunt my memory. "He is coming for you now. The one who hunts women in London follows us wherever the bridge goes. You have seen too much and you have shown too much kindness. He does not like men who protect women from their fate." I looked in the direction she was pointing and saw the Jack the Ripper figure approaching from the far end of the bridge, moving with deliberate purpose and carrying something metallic that gleamed in the streetlight. I ran to my security vehicle and drove off the bridge immediately, not stopping until I reached the bright lights and human activity of the main commercial district. I submitted my resignation the next morning and have never returned to London Bridge at night. Margaret and her fellow spirits from Victorian London continue their eternal reenactments in the Arizona desert, bound to stone and mortar that traveled thousands of miles but could not escape the tragedies of the past. Some historical artifacts should never be relocated, and some bridges connect more than just physical locations. My name is Robert, and I have been a traveling pharmaceutical sales representative for over 12 years. My territory covers the entire Southwest, which means I spend roughly 200 nights per year in hotel rooms across Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. I have stayed in everything from luxury resorts to roadside motels, and I thought I had experienced every possible variation of hospitality industry accommodation. That belief changed during a February business trip to Prescott, Arizona, when I encountered the Hotel Vendome and its most permanent residents. The Hotel Vendome was built in 1917 to serve the growing mining community around Prescott. Its 31 rooms and 16 bathrooms were considered luxurious for their time, and the establishment quickly became a respected fixture in the historic downtown district. The hotel sits at 230 South Cortez Street, just blocks from the famous Whiskey Row and within walking distance of the Yavapai County Courthouse. I had never stayed at the Vendome before, but my usual hotel was fully booked due to a winter festival, and the Vendome was the only accommodation available on short notice. The reservation system showed room 16 as the last available option, which seemed fortunate given my late booking. The rate was reasonable, and the online reviews were generally positive, though several mentioned unexplained occurrences and strange atmospheres. I arrived at the hotel around 8 p.m. on a Thursday evening in mid-February. The temperature had dropped into the 30s, and a light snow was beginning to fall, which was unusual for Prescott, but not unheard of during winter months. The hotel lobby was warm and inviting, decorated in period-appropriate furnishings that reflected the building's early 20th century origins. The desk clerk, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, checked me in with professional efficiency. When she handed me the key to room 16, however, her demeanor changed subtly. "Sir," she said quietly, "I need to mention that room 16 has a bit of history. Some guests have reported unusual experiences. If you would prefer a different room, we can arrange alternative accommodation at our sister property across town." I was exhausted from a long day of client meetings and had no interest in driving to another hotel through increasingly snowy conditions. I assured her that I was not concerned about ghost stories and that room 16 would be perfectly adequate for my needs. She nodded reluctantly and provided directions to the room, along with her personal cell phone number in case I needed anything during the night. Room 16 was located on the second floor, accessible via a narrow staircase with creaking wooden steps. The hallway was dimly lit by vintage fixtures that cast uneven shadows on the walls. The hotel maintained its historical character admirably, but the atmosphere felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with the building's age or architectural style. The room itself was larger than I had expected, furnished with antique pieces that appeared to be original to the hotel's opening period. A four-poster bed dominated the space, draped with heavy curtains that could be drawn for privacy. Two matching armchairs were positioned near a small fireplace, and a writing desk sat beneath the single window that faced the courtyard. What immediately struck me about the room was its temperature. Despite the heating system running audibly, the air felt significantly cooler than the hallway or lobby. I checked the thermostat and found it set to 72 degrees, but the actual temperature felt closer to 60. I adjusted the setting and assumed the older building simply had inefficient heating in certain rooms. As I unpacked my overnight bag, I became aware of a subtle floral scent that seemed to emanate from no identifiable source. It was pleasant but strong enough to be noticeable, like fresh lilacs or jasmine. I checked for air fresheners, potpourri, or flower arrangements, but found nothing that could account for the smell. The scent was strongest near the armchairs and seemed to fade as I moved toward other parts of the room. I had planned to work on sales reports for several hours before sleeping, so I set up my laptop on the writing desk and began reviewing client accounts and preparing for the next day's meetings. The work was routine, requiring concentration but not creative thinking, which made what happened next even more disturbing. Around 10:30 p.m., I became aware that I was no longer alone in the room. The sensation was immediate and unmistakable, like the feeling of being watched by someone standing just outside my peripheral vision. I looked up from my computer screen and scanned the room carefully, but saw nothing unusual. The feeling persisted, however, growing stronger rather than fading as psychological impressions usually do. I returned to my work, attributing the sensation to fatigue and the strange atmosphere of the old hotel. But within minutes, I heard what sounded like soft footsteps moving across the carpet near the bed. The sound was distinct and rhythmic, like someone pacing back and forth in a small area. When I turned to look, the room appeared empty, but the footsteps continued for several more seconds before stopping abruptly. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably during the footstep episode. My breath became visible, and I could feel cold air moving around me like a gentle breeze. The floral scent intensified to the point where it was almost overwhelming, filling my nostrils with the heavy sweetness of funeral flowers. I decided to take a break from work and called the front desk to report the heating problem. The desk clerk I had met earlier answered immediately, as if she had been expecting my call. "Mr. Thompson," she said before I could identify myself, "are you experiencing difficulties in room 16? I described the temperature issue and asked if maintenance could check the heating system. She listened patiently before explaining that the hotel had recently upgraded all their HVAC equipment, and room 16's system was functioning normally according to their monitoring systems. She offered to send someone to check the room personally, but something in her tone suggested this would be a futile exercise. "Sir," she continued carefully, "room 16 has a particular history that affects some guests more than others." The room was home to a woman named Abby and her husband in the early 1920s. When they lost ownership of the hotel due to financial difficulties, the new owners allowed them to remain in that room. One night, Mr. Beer left to obtain medication for Abby, who was suffering from tuberculosis, and he never returned. Abby refused to eat after his abandonment and eventually passed away in that room along with her cat. She paused before continuing. Many guests report sensing a presence in room 16. The experiences are always non-threatening, but they can be unsettling for those who are not prepared. Abby seems particularly active during winter months and late evening hours. I thanked her for the information and assured her that I was comfortable remaining in the room. As a rational person with a background in science, I was skeptical of supernatural explanations for what was most likely a combination of old building acoustics, heating irregularities, and psychological suggestion. I returned to my work with renewed focus, determined not to let hotel folklore interfere with my productivity. That determination lasted approximately 15 minutes. At 11:45 p.m., as I was finishing a particularly complex sales projection, I felt something brush against my ankle. The touch was light but unmistakably physical, like a cat rubbing against my leg in the affectionate way that cats seek attention from humans. I looked down and saw nothing, but the sensation continued for several seconds, complete with the subtle pressure and warmth that would accompany contact with a living animal. The touch moved around my leg in the characteristic figure-8 pattern that cats use to mark their territory and show affection. As I stared at my apparently empty surroundings, a woman's voice spoke clearly from the direction of the bed. "He promised he would come back," she said in a tone that combined sadness with lingering hope. "He said he just needed to get my medicine and then we could start over somewhere else." The voice was not threatening or angry, but it carried an emotional weight that seemed to fill the entire room. I could hear the pain of abandonment and the exhaustion of someone who had waited too long for promises that would never be fulfilled. It was the voice of someone who had died of heartbreak as much as physical illness. I turned toward the bed and saw the indentation of a human form on the coverlet, as if someone were lying there despite the visual absence of any person. The indentation was detailed enough to show the outline of a woman in a long dress with one arm curved as if she were holding something small against her chest. "I am sorry for your loss," I said aloud, feeling simultaneously foolish and compelled to respond. "I am sure he intended to return to you." The words came naturally, driven by the same professional courtesy I would show to any grieving person, regardless of their current state of existence. The indentation on the bed shifted slightly, and the woman's voice spoke again, this time with unmistakable gratitude. "Thank you for your kindness," she said. "So few people understand that love does not end simply because life does." The temperature in the room began to warm gradually, and the overwhelming floral scent faded to a more pleasant background level. I felt the invisible cat brush against my leg one final time before the sensation stopped completely. The oppressive feeling of being watched was replaced by something more peaceful, as if a great tension had been released. I completed my work without further incidents and slept soundly through the night. When I woke the next morning, room 16 felt like any other hotel room, with normal temperature and no unusual scents or sensations. My checkout experience was routine, and the desk clerk smiled warmly when she asked about my stay. "Abby appreciated your kindness," she said as she processed my payment. "She does not often interact with guests directly, but when she does, it is usually with people who show genuine empathy for her situation. I have stayed at the Hotel Vendôme twice since that February night, both times requesting room 16 specifically. Each visit has been peaceful and unremarkable, though I always sense a subtle welcome presence when I enter the room. I have come to think of Abby as a guardian spirit rather than a haunting, someone who continues to care for travelers even in her ongoing vigil for a love that will never return. The Hotel Vendôme represents something important about human connection and the persistence of emotion beyond physical existence. Not all ghosts are frightening, and not all hauntings are malevolent. Sometimes the dead simply need acknowledgement from the living, recognition that their stories matter and their love was real. Room 16 remains available for guests who are interested in experiencing something beyond ordinary hotel accommodation, and Abby continues to wait for her husband with the patience of someone who understands that true love transcends the boundaries of mortality.